Welcome everybody back to, this is our third What the Fucking Are. What the fuck is, oh, fourth. It's our fourth What the Fucking Are. Sorry, Carla. So for those of you who are new to this, What the Fuck is Cloud Native is our initiative to try to have this ongoing conversation with the community to answer this specific question. What is cloud native? Is it a set of technologies? Is it a mindset? Is it a way of going about your business? And today, specifically with Holly, we're going to be looking at cloud native culture. I am joined by my colleagues from Container Solutions, Carla and Teresa. You want to say hello, girls? Hi.
Hello.
Carla and Teresa will be helping me with questions in the chat box. They'll be moderating, sharing links and making sure that everything starts on time and finishes on time. Just because we swear quite a lot at Container Solutions, it doesn't mean we have no code of conduct. We, in fact, do have a code of conduct for our webinars, and it's almost the same as for our physical events. Please don't be obnoxious or you'll be thrown out. It's as simple as that. This is an inclusive group, an inclusive organization, and Carla will post the code of conduct now into the chat box if you want to read the long form version. Feel free to copy it. If you need it for your webinars, take the code of conduct and do what you want with it. Right. What will we be doing? So first, we've got a few announcements. Now, at this point, I'm expecting my colleague Charlotte to come in. Charlotte, are you actually on the call? Should have coordinated in advance. Oh, she's on the call. I'm getting the thumbs up. I'm getting the thumbs up. Charlotte's going to come in for 2 minutes and talk a little bit about Container Solutions, but we won't take long, I promise. So announcements, what have we got? In January, yeah, this is correct. So if you go outside of our window here at Container Solutions and turn left, there's the Financial Times. The Financial Times are an absolutely epic case study in cloud native transformation, going from on-premise to completely cloud native, but not just for the sake of it. They needed to pivot their business model in order to compete in an extremely rapidly changing world, and they succeeded in doing that. Sarah Wells is a little bit of a rock star now. I don't know if she would call herself a rock star, but she'll be joining us to talk about alert fatigue. What does it mean? If you build it and you run it, what does that do to your workforce? A fantastic case study that's coming up. Carla's going to share the link in the chat box if you want to sign up now. And then the other thing specifically to do with cloud native culture is about internal tech conferences. Now, you might be thinking, what has this got to do with Kubernetes? Good question. When we become cloud native, we start to do things differently. We collaborate differently. The way we speak to each other changes. And many of the companies that we've helped succeed with cloud native develop their own internal tech conferences. So instead of top-down emails and messages from the boss, we tend to share more. We tend to do open space. Matthew and Victoria have just written a book, so this is perfect timing, and they're going to come in and talk about how can you adopt internal tech conferences to support your cloud native transformation. Third announcement. I'm very sorry. I promised at the very beginning of the What the Fucking Are that we would never sell anything at Container Solutions, but I'm going to break my own rules for just 1 minute. We are actually a really nice company, completely diverse. We love green data centers. We like to pester the hyperscalers into becoming more green. We've got really high retention because people who come to work at Container Solutions often don't leave, but we're now growing and we're scaling. So we've got a strong demand for engineering managers. So we're hiring engineering managers. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to bring Charlotte in to say a few words about what it's like to work at CS and specifically what's it like to be an engineering manager, because that's what she is. Charlotte, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, I guess. So what's it like to be an engineering manager? It's honestly still quite new for me. So we just had our first engineering managers, what's it like 2 months ago? And we're all still finding our way. So it's a fun version of chaos and finding our own way. It gives you the opportunity to actually shape your work. It's part engineering. So we're still 50% doing technical work with clients, but we're also doing people management and strategy. So it's a fun mix of everything. And
we designed the role like that, didn't we, Charlotte? We designed the role because the engineering managers report directly to the CTO, where you work on strategy, but you've only got 7 or 8 reports, because one of the key things we're trying to do is upskill and coach our own engineers.
Exactly. There's a big focus on having our people and growing our people while also growing ourselves, because I mean, we never stop learning, right? So this is the idea, to be there for the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we call it a stepping stone role. So one of the things we're trying to do, of course, is introduce those responsibilities that you might later have as an executive. So for those people who want to end up as an executive one day, the engineering manager role is partially meant to support that.
Even though people have to work with you.
Even though they have to work with me, that's one of the downsides. It is true. That's one of the. Thank you, Charlotte. I'm glad that we've gone from trolling me on Slack privately to trolling me publicly on the internet. I think that's a level unlocked.
It's the way this goes. I think this speaks to our culture, that this is the kind of company where you can publicly insult your CEO and you'll get praised for it. So this is the fun part, right?
You will be getting a high five later on 15 fives. That's a good point, actually, Charlotte. We have a healthy disrespect for authority at Container Solutions. And this is because we want to move things forward and change the status quo. Right, Charlotte, I'm going to let you go now. Thank you for coming in. Okay, if anybody wants to apply for the job, please do. I've also asked Carla to share a LinkedIn post from me and a Twitter post from me. We've got a team of occupational psychologists at CS. This company and this role, if your friends have been battered by the pandemic, they are more than welcome at Container Solutions. If you want to share those links, fine. If you don't worry about it. Okay, next set of announcements. Okay, what the fuck is the industry gossip? This is going to take a few minutes, but let's just talk about quickly what's been going on. Right, the Google outage yesterday. What do we all think about this? On the one hand, we had a good conversation at Container Solutions internally. On the one hand, the Google outage itself showed just how much we all rely on Google. And so, for example, I was working on this deck for today, and then I thought, well, I can't work on the deck, so I'll tell you what, I'll work on my thank you note. But that was in Google Docs. So then I thought, well, I'll go and have my lunch. So I went outside, but my Playo card uses Google to authenticate. So I had no work to do and I couldn't get anything to eat. At the same time, it's a pretty remarkable feat that they were down for only about half an hour. And it seems that the biggest thing that caught the attention on Twitter, at least, was the fact that people's doorbells had stopped working, which of course we all found quite funny. Okay, so that's the gossip from Google, and it looks like that's back up and running. So fingers crossed that stays like that. Now we've got a good link or a good story to share about contact tracing. So this was very interesting because for all the promise of cloud native, it seems that all of the governments, ranging from the California, New York, the United Kingdom, Germany, all had a little bit of a contact tracing misfire. So we've been talking a lot about that internally, and that's something that we will share now in the chat box. And finally, this is pretty interesting gossip. So Shoreditch is just over there, like I'm pointing, you don't know where I'm sat, right? But I'm sat in Greenwich and the river's behind me in London. Shoreditch is over there where the Weave office is, the Weave UK office. And Weave have just raised a funding round, quite a large one. And we congratulated Alexis and the team over on Twitter. So very well done to them. They must be relieved closing that before Christmas. They must be very, very happy. But interestingly, 2 of the hyperscalers had invested, both Google and Amazon, I think. Carla's going to share the link now. And a telco also invested. So we are wondering here at Container Solutions if we see the market shifting now or the market evolving. I think this is probably, well, I don't think, this is an excellent step forward for cloud native in general, and it's an excellent step forward for GitOps, which is something that we have been pioneering. So many congratulations to them. Now, I did ask my engineering team for any more gossip, and all they could say was the only gossip we've got is that the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany, where we've all got offices, are about to go into tier 3 lockdown. So this is not very nice gossip. But the good news is Container Solutions have shipped out a mountain of alcohol to every single person who works at Container Solutions. And we'd said, this is not exactly gossip, but I'll put it in there anyway because we're running out of things to say. With that in mind, with that in mind, I just want to touch briefly on something more serious, a little bit to do with alcohol, but something a little bit more serious. So we know that the winter season is coming. And one of the things we did at Container Solutions at the top of the crisis was was publish our internal mental health guidelines. And that's because we knew people would be struggling with either being stuck in the house, feelings of isolation, possibly drinking too much. So we mentioned alcohol and drug use within the guidelines. This is where it's just reiterating right now as we enter into the Christmas season. Carla is going to share a link to all of the different helplines in the countries around the world. So for example, in the UK, we have the charity, the Samaritans, and in Germany, there is a German equivalent, and in the Netherlands. So if you have any feelings of loneliness, isolation, any dark thoughts over the winter period, you can pick up the telephone and take advantage of these different helplines. There's nothing to be ashamed about if you have feelings like that. If you're feeling okay, you're doing well, don't forget those around you. In engineering, we've got migrant workforces, young people from around the world who are expatriated to different countries in their 20s and in their 30s. They might need a helping hand over the winter season. So don't be scared to share these helplines on your own Slack channels or on Twitter, just to keep that conversation going and just to normalize talking about these difficult feelings during what is mainly a nice time of the year, but for some people can be a difficult time of the year. If you want to read our guidelines, you can. They're free to download, or you can read them on the blog. You can also share them with your companies. You can also hack them because they're released under an open source license. So that's just a note on mental health. Enjoy a drink, but don't go don't go crazy with the booze, and be mindful of your own mental health. Okay, fine. That's all of the announcements done. So you'll be grateful that I've managed to get through that in about, not bad actually, 16 minutes. If you've got any questions or follow-up, stick them in the Zoom chat and Carla will come back to you then. Right, we are only a few minutes away from introducing Holly now, but before we do so, I would like to frame culture in the wider cloud-native landscape. So at Container Solutions, we use this tool. Is it perfect? Hell no, of course it's not perfect. All models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And we find the cloud-native maturity matrix to be an extremely useful tool. And if you look at the different dimensions, we think of culture being the ones up at the top. And so, for example, in this scenario, it's actually a very common scenario. It's also a very common failure pattern. What you see here is the tech stack and the technical processes have taken a shift right, but we've left the cultural practices or processes behind. So as I mentioned earlier, when we talked about internal conferences, if you don't become a collaborative organization, if you stick with just iterative and incremental development, you're unlikely to tap into the power of cloud native. At the same time, the way we develop applications, we stop being feature driven and we become a little bit more data driven. And then, of course, my friend Matthew Skelton, who wrote Team Topologies, has a lot to say about teaming and DevOps. And for example, when we become fully cloud native, we start to become, we organize differently. And of course, that does have an effect on our culture. So this tool can be very useful when thinking about, well, specifically, what does culture mean? Is it to do with teams? Is it to do with mindset? And I wanted to pop this up now because this is how we would frame the cultural challenge. And that is basically all I would like to say. So without any more mucking around, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to ask Holly to share hers. Just give us a couple of seconds. And once she's done that, I'm going to do an introduction properly. Holly, how's it going with your screen sharing? Oh, she's there. She's made
so
it.
hopefully you can see it, and hopefully now you can see it full screen.
We can see it in full screen. Okay, so let me introduce you properly. So for those of you who don't know Holly, Holly Cummins works for IBM, specifically IBM Garage. I said earlier, this is the probably got the coolest job in the industry. Holly is a pretty tireless advocate of cloud native culture, a leader in our industry, and I think somebody that definitely I look up to, and a lot of the people at Container Solutions look up to. So we're pretty delighted to have this heavyweight come on, especially because it's the last the fucking hour before the Christmas break. So on that note, Holly, welcome. Small round of applause.
Thank you. I can, before I start, I'll sort of add that I think hopefully this won't be sort of too boring to people who just saw what you showed about culture, because I think we probably think in quite similar ways about culture and cloud native. And I really appreciated what you said about the holiday seasons as well. And it's been a tough year for mental health. And I think the holidays can always be so tough for mental health, because there's these sort of two factors. One is that if everybody else is miserable and you're miserable, then you're all sort of miserable together. But at Christmas, there's this sort of atmosphere of joy. And then if you're not miserable, it's sort of extra horrible to look around and see everybody having this sort of expectation to be happy. And you're thinking, oh, but I'm not really enjoying this. And then as well, there's this sort of, there's so much pressure to do things. So of course, for this webinar, I should have been in bed at 10 o'clock, you know, to be super fresh and bright. And instead I was making cookies at midnight. So if I don't make any sense, it's the fault of Christmas and the cookies. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk. I've really been looking forward to this, and you know, as I said, I think culture is such an important topic. So you asked me to talk about what the fuck is culture in cloud native. I have corrected your title slightly. I think it should be what the fuck culture is cloud native. It's such an important thing. So there, I've fixed your title. And I really started thinking about culture and about what cloud native was and what cloud native wasn't a year or two ago, because it's one of those terms that gets used a lot. And each time it's used in quite a specific way, but each usage can be really different. And so Daniel Bryan, I saw this tweet from him, and he was praising Bilgin Ibrahim, who's now a colleague of mine at Red Hat, but who at the time was not, because this was a few years ago. And he said, oh, I really love the way Bilgin framed this definition of cloud native. And so if you look at the picture, what he's showing is he's showing sort of a progression. So, you know, a few years ago, our industry was doing SOA, and then we moved to microservices, and then cloud native is framed as a progression of microservices, where you've got the services have become stupider and the platform has become smarter. And I looked at this, and Bilgin really knows his stuff. He's written such a lot of good things. But I looked at this and I thought, I don't recognize this definition of cloud native at all, because I feel like I've been writing cloud native applications for a few years, and I had almost never done microservices because they weren't right for the problems that I was solving. So I thought, well, wait a minute, does this mean that I'm not doing cloud native because I'm not doing microservices? And then if so, what am I doing? And it's this sort of super technical definition of cloud native, which is really all about your network topology and your deployment topology. At the other end of the spectrum is what Jamie just showed, and the sort of the cloud native maturity matrix. And here it is, the big version again. And I really like this, you know, for me, this one resonates really well. And so instead of putting it on this sort of technical axis as an extension of microservices, it frames it in terms of the processes. So we started with waterfall, and then we go to agile, and cloud native is sort of an extension of agile. And then what I like as well is this last column, because I think at the moment we sometimes use cloud native just to mean the state of the art, and if it's modern and good, it's cloud native. But of course, at some point, we're going to move past that. And so it's interesting to think, well, what doesn't count as cloud native, and what could we be doing that isn't sort of within the bounds of cloud native? And I really like, as well, as Jamie mentioned, I really like the idea that you have to be kind of going along all of these things. Otherwise, if you go too far on one row and you don't go on the other row, we sometimes call this incomplete adoption. And so it means, you know, you're just not going to be getting the benefits because you know, you're really good on one axis, but not on the others. Oops. So another way of framing it, and I really like this one as well, this is from my colleague, Kyle Brown, and he's framed it as sort of three components. So you have the people and process, that cultural aspect, but there's also a technology aspect. And of course, those two enable each other. So we can't do the cool cloud native culture. All of the things that we do, like, you know, super rapid releases, those are enabled by the technology. If we were still working on physical disks, we couldn't be doing that. And then he makes a distinction as well between architecture and technology, which I sort of, in my head, I tend to mush them together, but I think he's really right that they're different. So we have, how do we design our systems? How do we work with one another? And then what's the technology? And you need all three, and there's an interplay between them. So there's the sort of the big version of that one. But for me, I mentioned that when I saw Bilgin's definition, it didn't resonate with me, even because I felt like I'd been doing cloud native for a while. And I think that's partly because, you know, I'm old and I've been doing cloud native for a while, but also I remember this sort of original definition of cloud native, which came out in around 2010. So that was way before Kubernetes, and it was even way before microservices. As an industry, we started talking about microservices in 2013. And so what Paul Fremantle defines cloud native as is being able to fully utilize the cloud environment. So if we have something and we put it in the cloud, but it's actually exactly the same as it was on premise, then that is not cloud native. If it's really taking advantage of the capabilities of the cloud, that's cloud native. And I really like that definition as well. And I was sort of relieved to see the other day, because I thought I might be the only person who remembered this definition, because, you know, in tech, 10 years is an eternity. But, you know, someone else, Ian Cooper, who's quite active in the London tech scene on the .NET side, you know, is saying, yeah, it does seem perverse that cloud native, who, you know, I thought the origins just implied built to operate in cloud infrastructure, as opposed to sort of lifting and shifting, now means running on Kubernetes. And we do find this sort of, this phrase, which always makes me cringe a little bit, which is when we say we're going to migrate something to be cloud native. And I kind of think if you're migrating it, I'm fairly sure that means it wasn't cloud native. But again, you know, there's lots of different definitions, all of which means we can sort of throw in the literal definitions as well. If it's quite foggy, we're living in the cloud, we're cloud native. And I mean, basically, I think what all of this shows is that none of us have any idea, and we can talk about it for ages, but we might not get any closer to an actual definitive answer of what is cloud native. So at that point, I think what we need to do is we need to go and we need to look at the definition of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So what they say is cloud native computing uses microservices and containers, and it's dynamically orchestrated. So that's really consistent with Bilgin's definition that I said I wasn't super comfortable with. So then that puts me in this really awkward position where I'm sort of saying, I don't really like that microservices definition and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. What do they know about cloud native computing? So the first time I sort of said that, I was a bit worried that I'd never be invited back anywhere to talk about cloud native computing again, and that the CNCF would blacklist me. Luckily, that hasn't happened, and I seem to get invited back. And I was extra reassured as well, because Sam Newman, who was on one of the earlier What the Fucking Hours, he said the same thing as me. He said that this interesting side effect of the CNCF, who are so closely associated with Kubernetes and with microservices, is that he ends up talking to people who say, I want to be cloud native, so I'm going to go to Kubernetes. And saying, well, those are two different things. They enable each other, but they're two different things. So having a bit of excitement. There we go. And I noticed as well, I was relieved to see that even the CNCF, actually, they've changed their definition of cloud native. So the one I showed earlier was from 2019. If you look now, they don't actually have a definition of cloud native on their website. They say, oh, go look at this definition, which is in GitHub. And so if you see something in GitHub, you think, oh, that's probably going to be changing a lot. And sure enough, if you look at the history for it, you can see there's 18 contributors. So it's definitely a definition by committee, because so many of us have an idea about what cloud native is. And if you look at the history, you can see it sort of goes and goes. And some of these are translations, but a lot of them are wording changes as well. So it just keeps going and going and changing and changing. And then if you look even further, if you look at the first commit, you can see that even that first commit actually came from a Google Doc. So it was as well that there wasn't a Google outage that day, that had 11 drafts itself. So, you know, this is a definition that has a lot of people changing it and being uncertain about it. And, you know, I see this when I talk to people, when you say, what is cloud native? Everybody will have a good idea. So, you know, some people will say that Paul Fremantle definition of born on the cloud. Some people will say microservices. Some people will say Kubernetes, like, you know, like they're doing to Sam Newman. Some people will say DevOps. So a lot of the practices like collaboration that we associate with cloud native are also really strongly associated with DevOps. So they end up being sort of quite closely tied. Some people take that even further, and I think we sort of end up with this grab bag where if it's like a modern and good practice, then it's cloud native. And we don't need to be any more specific than that. I think sometimes we get so used to saying cloud native that we forget you can say cloud without saying cloud native. So we just say cloud native when actually we just mean cloud. And then sometimes what we mean is idempotent. This one doesn't get used very often because it creates lots of confusion. What idempotent really means is rerunnable. So that's that cloud characteristic that if you take it down and you bring it back up again, it better be kind of just as good, or else it's not going to behave well in the cloud. So we've got all these definitions. Where do we go from here? I think one thing that is helpful is to start with all of those are, you know, kind of okay, but let's think about what cloud native is not. And I would say cloud native is definitely not a synonym for microservices. And I think even the CNCF, like in their original definition, although they talked a lot about microservices, their new definition, if you look at it, it says microservices exemplify this approach. So they've changed the emphasis. They're not saying you have to be doing microservices to be doing cloud native. They're saying microservices are a good example of cloud native, which I think makes a lot more sense. And things like immutable infrastructure are also, so if you've got a lot of immutable infrastructure, even if you don't have any microservices, you could be in pretty good cloud native shape. But I think, you know, with all of those definitions, probably we want to roll back and not worry too much about the words, but step back and think, well, what problem are we trying to solve? And with that, I think a good thing to do is to sort of try not to be driven by the fashions in our industry, which is hard because of course we want to look at the best practices, but everyone else is doing it is not a good reason to do cloud native. And we sometimes end up in this wishful mimicry where I think we adopt some of the practices that leaders do. So we say Netflix do microservices. We should do microservices to be as good at engineering as as Netflix, but we don't look at the other rows on that matrix. And we don't say, oh, but we need to be doing this with our culture, and we need to be doing, you know, this with our pipelines. Otherwise, we're not going to get the same effect that we got at Netflix. And so I think that kind of incomplete adoption and that wishful mimicry do cause problems. And really the thing that we should be looking at, and what the CNCF said, is we want to do this because we want to build great products, so really good quality, and we want to do it faster. We want to get to market faster. In the latest version, they have something similar, but they've made it a bit more precise, which I like. So it's not just that it's going to be great if we're cloud native, it's we're going to be making high impact changes frequently and predictably. So we're not going to sort of end up with a sort of a storm of horrors every time we make a change. And it's going to be minimal toil. So it's going to be automated. It's not going to be repetitive work. And I think that definition does, and the sort of why for cloud native goes back to the why for cloud. And it's useful to think about this because I've been doing cloud for so long. I realized at some point I didn't know why I was doing cloud, and I couldn't remember what was better about the cloud. And we originally started doing cloud for cost reasons. Running it in someone else's data center was cheaper than running it in our own data center. And the part of that was sort of economies of scale. But the main reason it's cheaper in the cloud is that elasticity. So instead of having to buy hardware for our maximum capacity, we can pool that capacity and we can scale up and down and only pay for what we actually need at any particular time. Another benefit we see with the cloud is speed, and that's partly the speed of hardware. So we get, sort of exotic hardware and GPUs that can go faster, but it's mostly about the speed to market. And that's not that someone else's data center is faster than ours, it's that the way we use someone else's data center gets us to market faster. And then, as I said as well, there are those exotic capabilities. So if you want a quantum computer, that's going to be on the cloud. If you want a big array of GPUs, you could put that in your own data center, but it's going to be way more effective to do it in the cloud. So then stepping on, you think, well, that's all pretty good. Why do I need cloud native if I get all that with cloud? And the problem is a lot of organizations, when they started using the cloud, got electrocuted. It turns out that you need to do things differently in the cloud. And that's where that definition of cloud native was written for the cloud, so we didn't end up with all these horrible uncloud anti-patterns in it. So with all of these definitions, I think the one that makes most sense to me is it's the combination of culture and technology, not just for its own sake, but to achieve those cloud goals of elasticity and time to market. So as long as we're all agreed on the goal, we're good. But of course, actually, we're not. So, we still do end up with things like someone writes an app that they think is cloud native, but it hasn't got any microservices in it and their stakeholders are annoyed. Or they're on the cloud and it's only saving money. So then the stakeholders are annoyed. But again, going back to that thing, I think what we can definitely say is microservices, they're not a goal in themselves. They're a means. And this is really important. So we were talking, a bank in Asia Pacific came to the IBM garage and they said, can you help us? We've got this big COBOL estate. We need to modernize it because our competitors are eating our lunch. Great, yeah, we can help you. And then they added, our release board meets twice a year. So it doesn't matter how many microservices you have. It doesn't matter how beautifully decoupled they are. If your release board meets twice a year, you've completely missed that other part of the matrix and you're not going to get that benefit of cloud. And I think, again, it comes back to this wishful mimicry that we look at containers and they're a great technology, and we look at some organizations and they're using 500 containers per application, and we say, oh, that's great. Maybe if I use 1,000 containers in my application, I'll be even more cloud native, even if I only release once a year. Well, no, you won't. And what that thing about being decoupled, I think, is a really optimistic assumption, because what we often see as well is we get a lot of containers, but it's not actually, it's distributed, but it is not decoupled. It is a distributed monolith, which is kind of like a normal monolith, but way worse, because you lose your compile time checking and you lose that guaranteed function execution that you get if you're all in the same process. And so then we end up with this situation where I was called into a client, and they called me in because they said, every time we change one microservice, another breaks. And of course, this is not the dream of decoupling that microservices are supposed to achieve, but we see this all the time. And it's because we assume that if we're distributed, we're decoupled. Well, no, just because the communication mechanism doesn't actually ensure decoupling. And so then we end up with this thing, which is cloud native spaghetti. And it's still spaghetti, and it's even scarier than spaghetti because it's in the cloud. So this is from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, and you can see it's firing out meatballs from the cloud, which is the sort of the true horror situation that you wish to avoid with cloud native. So as a sort of another example of this that doesn't involve software, this is the Mars Climate Explorer. And so this is what it looks like when it's not drawn really badly. And you can see it kind of looks a bit like it's made out of a bin liner and duct tape. I think there was actually more solid engineering in it than that. But it did have quite a sad fate, which is it was supposed to go round Mars and look at the climate. And instead it went into Mars. And that was the end of the Explorer. And when they looked to try and figure out what had gone wrong, why weren't we able to steer this thing properly, they realized that it had two control systems. One was on the Mars Climate Explorer itself, and that made sort of small adjustments. And then for the bigger adjustments, they were done from a control module on Earth. So this is a super distributed system. And one of them is actually like beyond the clouds. The problem was the two teams doing it didn't really talk enough to each other. So on the Explorer itself, it used metric units. The Earth station used imperial units. And so the numbers were sort of close enough that nobody noticed the problem. Nobody thought to do end-to-end testing, which was a little bit of a problem. And the effect was that the system malfunctioned. And I think we can definitely say in this case, it is a very distributed system. Distributing did not help. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I will add that they didn't do end-to-end tests, and they also didn't do any kind of contract test. So they didn't do anything to test that the assumptions each system was making about the other systems were correct. And that's where failures happen in a system. So if you're doing microservices, you really need those consumer-driven contract tests. Another thing to note about this on the subject of culture is that the navigators on the ground, each time it sort of came back into orbit and they looked at it, they thought, something doesn't seem quite right. I expected it to be here and it's here. It's just a little bit off. And so they warned that something was wrong, but they didn't fill in the right form. And because they didn't fill in the right form, nothing was done. And there was this massive disaster. So again, this sort of shows, I think, that sort of cultural element of if you rely too much on bureaucracy and paperwork rather than doing the right thing, you may seem like everything's quite safe and controlled, but actually you're going to get disasters. And there's this sort of quality theater where there's all the paperwork, but there's not actually the quality. Another problem I see a lot is about continuous integration, and really it's continuous integration theater. So if a client says to me, we have a CI/CD, that makes me really worried, because continuous integration and continuous delivery, it's something you do. It's not a tool that you buy. And when we sort of treat it as a tool, we end up with things like, I've heard, I'll merge my branch into our CI next week. Well, if it's continuous integration and you only merge once a week, that's not continuous, at least not in my definition. And, we see things like, there's all this talk about CI/CD and CI/CD, and then there's sort of throw in, and we release every 6 months. Well, if you're only releasing every 6 months, that's not continuous deployment. And we end up with this thing where the word continuous suddenly doesn't actually mean anything like continuous because it's a tool, not a practice. That just makes me sad. And of course, when we're thinking about continuous integration, which is basically, integration is pushing to master, how often should you do that? You could be literally continuous and push every character. That would obviously, it would be continuous, but it would be ridiculous. More reasonable is to do it every commit, and that you've got these really small commits, so you're doing it several times an hour. Also reasonable is maybe, several times a day, and you do it every few commits. If you could do it once a day, once a week, or once a month, these are pretty bad practices, or once every 6 months. And once every 6 months seems ridiculous. But when I joined IBM 20 years ago, so I should say this over and over again, it was 20 years ago, I was advised that in order to avoid getting focus on the build call, the best thing to do was to batch up my changes and push them once every 6 months, because that way I couldn't break the build, so I wouldn't get in trouble. I'm a huge advocate of trunk-based development. So you get that continuous pushing. The technical definition of trunk-based development is that you have to be pushing at least once a day. So if you're on the left side of that, then that's okay. Otherwise, it's pretty bad. In terms of releasing, so a release, really, that's that deployment. You could do it every push, which is pretty hardcore. And you've got to have a really good handle on feature flags if you're doing that. If you do it once a sprint, yeah, it's okay. And of course, what we used to do is we used to do it every 2 years because it had to go into physical CTs. every epic, okay, you know, I think every user story, that feels really nice. That feels like you're getting this continuous stream of value. What about, so that deployment is out to production. What about testing and staging? So that's the continuous delivery part of CD. I think really that it's got to be every push. You know, there's sort of not a debate on that one. There is usually a lot of debate about that continuous deployment, and a lot of organizations are really, really reluctant to release things even in the cloud. And so then I sort of say, well, why? What's so scary about releasing, or at least, you know, doing a deployment? And often, even if it's microservices, there's an assumption that they all have to be done at the same time. And I've seen continuous deployment pipelines that enforce that every single microservice gets released at the same time. And again, at that point, why are you even having microservices? Because the point of microservices was to give you that speed of release. But if you have to wait for everybody in the application, in the organization to be ready, you're not going to have that speed. It's just going to be really, really slow. So then we have this architecture that supports speed, but we're not actually going faster. And what's the point? And it's because it's all about that feedback. So you would never, ever dream of driving a car with your hand over your eyes, and check where you're going every 2 minutes. It would be a good way to kill a pedestrian. But when we're engineering, that's often what we do, is we don't get these fast feedback cycles. But feedback, it's good engineering, and it's just good business as well. And if it's too scary to actually be exposing these features to users, you can separate the process of deployment from the process of releasing. So you can deploy things, but not actually wire them in. You can deploy them, but control them with a feature flag so that only a small subset of your population who are really friendly to you see it. You can use A/B testing or canary deploys or that kind of thing to make sure that there's nothing horrible before it goes out to the biggest user base. So that's all ways to get to what we should be doing, which is that a release shouldn't be the sort of thing where we do this huge release and it's such a big deal and then we all collapse and, you know, have champagne because we managed to do the release. It should be that a release is a really, really boring thing that we go, oh yeah, whatever, another release, because we do it so often. And another aspect of this has to do with, what if something goes wrong? If something goes wrong and you only release every 6 months, that's really bad because fixing it is going to be really hard. But if recovery from failures is also really boring because you do it often, that sounds like a terrible thing that we're failing all the time. But actually, if you have a problem and you get that rapid feedback, you discover it really quickly, you make the change really quickly, then your quality is going to be a lot higher than if you only do fix it every 6 months. So, you know, even that recoverability is something that we should be practicing all the time. And to do that, of course, we need the technological practices in terms of the pipelines and the automation, but we also need the cultural practices and the psychological safety that we can admit if something's wrong. And we say, oh, you know, I think we need to, you know, revise this release because look, I can see a problem on the dashboard. Not, please don't fire me. I'm going to pretend that there was no failure. So that, you know, the sort of the ideal is if there's a problem, it's back in milliseconds and there's no data loss. If we get back really fast and there's data loss, that's not so good. As soon as we need to have a manual intervention or a sign off, or worse yet, handoffs where several people have to sort of pass work from person to person, then that system is going to be slow to recover. It's going to be days. And that's when users are going to be really angry. So basically, handoffs bad, automation good. And really, you know, that automation, just I think part of, you know, we've been doing this for ages, but especially with cloud native, you've got to be automating everything. And often I'll see microservices architectures, but the tests aren't automated. And if you're doing microservices, you need automated tests, because if you don't have those automated tests, basically you have no idea at any particular point whether your code works. Maybe it worked yesterday, but it doesn't today. And that's really bad. And among other things, it stops you from shipping, because an organization, if they don't know if things work, there's no way they're going to ship. So you need those automated integration tests, and you need those automated contract tests. And the other thing is, I think you really need to be a very good friends with your CI/CD. So sometimes I'll go to a client, and it'll take me quite a long time to find the build and to figure out if the build is green or red. And because there's not that sort of status that's in everybody's face about whether the build's good. So, you want to be having that pervasive build. It wants to be part of the furniture. So you need that kind of build radiator, the traffic lights. Harder when we're working at home, but it should be there, because the build is the thing that shows the automation, and we want to keep it green. And what we sometimes see is we see this broken windows situation where when I eventually do find the build, I look at it and it's red, and I say, oh, look, everybody, crisis, problem, look, the build's red. And they say, yeah, that build's been broken for a few weeks. Well, no, it should be our highest priority to keep the build green, because otherwise our automation isn't doing us any good. We're not discovering failures. So that's the sort of what's on us as developers. But there's another part of it, which is what the rest of the organization does, and they need to change too. So if we treat cloud the way we treat on-premise, it's not going to work. And we need to as well be adjusting how we handle things. So I spoke to a bank, and they were starting to work on the cloud, but they had a really bad problem with how their network was configured, because it had been completely oriented towards on-prem work. And when developers started to work on the cloud, in order to see the cloud provider, they had to be able to go outside the firewall. But if they were going outside the firewall, they couldn't actually see anything inside the firewall. You had to choose outside or inside. So basically, you could either access the cloud server or your internal Jira. And so half the developers didn't have the tools that they needed to do their jobs. And it was so frustrating for the developers, because they just couldn't do their job. And we often see as well this really heavy setup process where, something new will start and people are like, yeah, I want to write code. And then a week later, they finally get to where they can write the code, because it takes 2 days to get a repo provisioned. It takes 2 days to get a pipeline provisioned. And so there's just all this friction. And of course, we see that, I talked already about the release boards and the architecture boards, and often those institutions just can't keep pace. So I worked on a project, we released it, it was great. And then the client said, oh, and we've scheduled the architecture board. But I said, but it's already live. We know the architecture works because it's out there, but we still had to do this architecture review because half the processes hadn't caught up with the realities of the cloud. I heard another story as well. I didn't personally experience this, but a few years ago, IBM had a complaint from a client because they came back to us and they said, this provisioning software that you've sold us is broken. And you told us that you'd give us this nifty software and we could provision a virtual instance in 10 minutes. And what they were actually experiencing is that it took them 3 months to provision an instance. And they thought the fault was with our software. But when we actually investigated, we found that they'd put an approval process in front of the provisioning. And then someone else had put another approval step, and then someone else had put another approval step. And what ended up at the end was an 84-step approval process. So I'm actually amazed that they were able to get an instance in 3 months. And so it's just, again, the organizations have to catch up with the cloud, or you're not going to get the benefit of the cloud. And that sort of old style governance where you want to put so much heavy manual governance, it breaks my heart, because it's sort of, you take the beauty of the cloud is it's so frictionless, and then this old style governance just takes that away. And we see some kind of funny tactics to try and work around this. So we were talking to they're a car manufacturer, and they were with one cloud provider, but they were going to change cloud providers. And we said, oh, okay, yeah, why are you changing cloud providers? We can help. And they said, we have this cloud provider, but it takes us so long to provision instances with them because of the way we have the procurement set up. So we're going to go to a different provider to fix our internal procurement process. And I thought, I'm not sure that's going to work. I think probably procurement are going to catch up and they're going to do the exact same thing to the new cloud. So you don't need to be changing that external thing. You need to be changing your internal cloud. And really, you know, going back to that matrix, if the developers are the only ones who are changing cloud native, it's not going to work. And there's a bigger cost than that as well. So part of it is that your cloud native transformation isn't going to succeed. But the other thing is developers vote with their feet. And if it's really horrible and frictionful to work somewhere, they're going to go to another company where they can actually work with flow and do their jobs. And I think when we think about automation, what we have to sort of think about, this is sort of like a lot of words, and I haven't found a better way to say it with fewer words, but if you automate something, you then have to sort of go out and you have to change the processes around the thing that you just automated that assume that the thing you just automated is expensive or error prone. And I think that's where we get the problems, is we have this beautiful automation, but nothing else changed. And so when we're delivering software, we can't just look at one part of it. Like we can't have a super efficient provisioning process if we have a really slow test process, because we want to be optimizing that whole system to get value to the end user. And if we're just optimizing one part of it, that's not going to give the outcome that we hope for. So that's a whole bunch of bad and a whole bunch of don't do this. What does good look like? I think the first thing is that, you know, you have to, as an organization, be clear on what you're trying to achieve. There's lots of different goals. All of them are good, but you have to be aligned on which one you're working towards. Optimize for feedback at every stage of the process. Optimizing for feedback should be that guiding principle. It has to be okay to make mistakes. You have to have that psychological safety. Otherwise, you end up with a culture where you don't have that feedback because people hide mistakes. And collaboration, it's just so good. There's so many good things about collaboration. So it's a really effective way to deliver good software. It's a really effective way to deliver software that meets user needs. But also, you know, it just feels nice working together rather than working in silos and, you know, hating the people in the other silo. It just feels so much nicer. It's such a pleasant way to work. And I think in lockdown, a lot of us have kind of realized how much we miss our colleagues, and how much of what made work really nice was that interaction and building something together. And so whether we're remote or not, that human connection and that co-creativity is a joy of our jobs. And so with that, we've got time for discussion and questions. And really interesting to see what you think as well, Jamie.
Thanks, Holly. Well, before we get to that, I think we all need to unmute ourselves and give a small round of applause to Holly. Well done. Come on, unmute yourselves, people. It's Christmas. What's the matter with you?
Thank you.
Your last point about culture, Holly, I think this is an interesting one, because in design patterns from architecture, they talk about the quality without a name, QUAM. And you can walk into a company that all the dashboards, lots of continuous integration, whiteboards everywhere, but if there's no collaboration, you feel it. So as a consultant, I've seen loads of companies succeeding with cloud native, and many who are trying to succeed, but they don't have that collaborative element. And I can feel that emotionally before I can identify it. And without collaboration, in my opinion, you got no cloud native.
Yeah, there's a wonderful quote, I think it's from Kent Beck, where he says that he went to a client and the most valuable thing he did for them was telling them how to rearrange their office furniture. You know, so he had all of this technical knowledge, but he could sort of see that, you know, one team was sat in one room and another team was sat in another room. And he's like, well, you're not going to be able to collaborate like this. Why don't you move the desks here? And that was actually the thing that improved the delivery.
So there's a funny thing at Container Solutions. People think we're all kind of left wing and kind of hippies. because that's, maybe we project that image. But the truth is modern cloud native needs Linux specialists, testers, design thinkers, user interface designers. And if you can't play well, it's hard to play the cloud native game in our experience.
Yeah, definitely. One of the questions that I sort of go back and forth on is how much should you have specialists who are collaborating, and how much should you have generalists? Yeah. And there's benefits to each, but certainly if you have the specialists, they need to be collaborating.
Yeah, if you've got specialists who can play well, I think you're winning. Right, now, who's got the courage to unmute themselves and ask a question to Holly? And if you don't quite have the courage, you can also stick it in the chat box, or you can put your hand up and then we'll come and find you.
Hi, Ryan Bamford.
Hello, Ryan.
Hi. I suppose I've got two questions which kind of works. First one is, and I've kind of posted it in the chat and I've had one comment about the open policy agent, but we're a secure PCI compliance level 1 provider. And so a lot of the governance and standards and stuff that we have put through onto our processes in the past are based around the PCI compliance process. How do we map the new ways of working? It's one of the things that we've had to find problems with still going through those standards when those standards are quite slow to adapt to the modern way of working. So a lot more of the next standard will be intent based, but at the moment it's still quite, you will have this reviewed by this person and this person and this person type of thing. So I'm just wondering if you've gone through things like that. And then the other question that I had, I'll kind of do them at both at once, is a lot of the examples we've seen of people working have been very productized ways of working. So you have a product team which are constantly delivering improvements on this product all the time and making it better. But what if you are more of a software house who delivers bespoke services? So you could, in theory, have 20 to 30 different applications that are all being created at the same time, but you've got, let's say, one security expert or two security experts. How do you manage the context switching so you can actually get that person's time to be part of that cross-functional team? Because that's where we find the cross-functional team is a great in principle. We'd love to have it, but you can't have one person on 30 different stand-ups because they would do nothing and they just can't do anything. Yeah. So I don't know how you would look at solving those types of clashes.
Yeah, those are both super, super good questions. So let me go through them in order. So on the PCI DSS, I think there's sort of three things that you can do. One, and I think you're probably doing most of these already. One is, wherever possible, try and encode your compliance into an automation rather than doing it by hand. So often when you read the regulation, if you sort of look really closely, it will say, oh, this has to be done, but it doesn't specify whether it has to be done by a computer or a person. So you automate it. The other, and I think you're doing this as well, is you read the regulation really closely. And in some of them, there's a suggestion for what you do, but then there's a sort of a little footnote that says, but there is an exception process, and if you can show that you're achieving the same thing in a different way, then that's good enough. And a lot of the fintechs and a lot of the modern banks and that kind of the challenger banks are doing that. So they're not strictly following the regulations in the main lettering, but they are able to demonstrate that they're, as you say, that they're achieving the intent of the regulation. And even with the current regulation, that's kind of just about close enough. But another thing that you can do is you can limit the blast radius of the regulation. So with things like separation of duties, for example, if we think that, going back to what I was saying about specialists versus generalists, if we think that we want to have generalists who are able to control, do all stages of the life cycle, but we know that for PCI reasons we can't, let's isolate that little PCI bit of the application away. Let's do that according to the letter of the law, and let's do things the way we want to in the rest, so that we, again, just like I said, sort of about, we don't like the regulation much, let's limit the impact to our whole team, even though we need to stick to it. In terms of the being spread thinly across a lot of teams. This is something that I've been thinking about recently as well, because in my team, we usually have a full-time, we sort of go from project to project, and we all have a team assigned to that project, and it works so nicely and so well. And as well, because we do pair programming, we manage to limit distraction so effectively, because we say, well, if you invite me to a meeting, you're actually interrupting both of us, so that I think you don't want that cost. Why don't you just not have a meeting? So we were able to work dedicated to one thing 100%, and it was really effective. That doesn't work in all contexts. There's places where it works, and as you say, there's places where it just doesn't work. One thing you can try and do is that planned time slicing. So you can say, well, this week, Bob, the security specialist, is working on project A. Next week, Bob, the security specialist, is working on project B, and he's sort of quite dedicated for a period of time. But then in order to make that work, there's another trade-off, which is you all of a sudden have to be doing really quite strict planning. And all of these projects have to interlock their plans to say, well, we need to be ready for Bob on week 2, because that's when we're going to get Bob. And if we're not ready for Bob, that doesn't work. So all of a sudden, then it actually becomes really expensive. So that's not so good, although it does have some advantages. The other thing you can do is you can have the multiple backlogs, where you have like the Bob backlog, and then people put things into the Bob backlog, but then each project has multiple backlogs, which becomes difficult to manage. So that's a really long way of saying I haven't quite worked out the right thing to do yet either. It definitely does have, it's a pragmatic necessity, but it does have an overhead, either in terms of increased planning or decreased effectiveness.
Doesn't hiring come into this, Holly? So if Bob needs to be in so many places at once, because I know when we work with customers, they assume the cloud native transformation will not require changes to the staffing. And it's quite it's a wrong assumption, because often you need different skills. And in the old days, I started my life off as an extreme programmer. So that's the Kent Beck school of thought. And you would have a couple of specialists who would never be fully utilized, never be fully busy, but they would enable multiple teams to keep busy all the time. So when I worked at a large airline, for example, we would duplicate the Bobs, have 2 or 3 expensive people, but they would enable a whole program of work to continue. What is your take on that?
Yeah, definitely. So there's sort of 2 things that you could do. One is you could say, well, actually, we just need 2 Bobs, so we hire 2 Bobs. But if Bob isn't fully utilized, then you're right that it's that specialist versus generalist thing of can Bob be sharing his knowledge widely enough that people can make progress without Bob, enough that it lightens that planning load, it lightens that context switching, and then we pair with Bob, we do the brain extract from Bob, and then we can sort of, do well enough.
So Ryan, does that answer your question, or begin to answer your question?
Yeah, it's sort of pointing it more in as rather than having what we'd class as a fully cross-functional team with members continually with the project, is dropping the more directly skilled people in for a shorter period of time, whereby which we could then leverage the skill set, but without completely killing them. I think when you're talking about certain things like the security level, they are so few and far between, being able to hire people at that potential level where they've got the skill sets that you're looking at. I think that possibly the time limiting slotting in, but I think in other areas, I think the additional resource is probably better.
Ryan, did you ever take a look at Matthew's Team Topologies book?
I haven't, no. We did get it, but it was on the shelf and then we were all sent to go home. So it's still in the office.
Best excuse ever.
I'll find your email later and I'll either send you some stuff, I'll get the team to send you some stuff.
Cool.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Ryan. Anybody else want to unmute themselves and pop in now and ask a question to Holly?
Yeah, I have one, Zuzana. So Holly, thanks for the speech. I would like to know what your experience with companies moving to that were not in an incipient phase and are doing cloud native at scale. Because some clients of mine, they start doing, they can do this for 1, 2, 3 applications, but they are struggling to do this on scale. So any advice, any hints and tips on this one?
Yeah, this is another one where the short answer is, yeah, I have that problem too. I wish I knew the answer. I've a couple of times I've almost started writing a blog post of, is everything always awful at scale? Because we do see this pattern with, exactly as you say, things work really nicely when there's a small number involved, and then you have to scale it up because a pattern isn't valuable if you can't scale it. And yet at scale, you start to see problems. And as well, I think at scale, you just necessarily do start to see more overhead because you need that coordination between the teams. You need more program level governance, even if it's lightweight governance. So I think the first thing is to recognize that things will be different at scale, and that you do need to make some special allowances for scale rather than just trying to copy a beloved pattern and just sort of assume that it can go out without changing anything. But you have to, again, sort of on the changes, have that, well, what problem are we trying to solve? What problems are we seeing? And can we do continuous improvement to try and define governance structures that solve the problems we're experiencing without adding this oppressive weight of governance?
Got it, thanks.
Any more questions? There's a little bit of a discussion happening in the chat box. So Richard has asked about minimizing stones in the streams and saying that some things, some processes have to remain manual because they're simply outside of the whole cloud native paradigm. Now, I always type in a response to that. We do have lots of customers who still have manual steps, but I would definitely say they were cloud native. And building those steps in is what you do in the collaborative element of cloud native. So, for example, Greg Hawkins, who helped build Starling Bank, a lot of their processes were semi-automated, meaning they entered into Slack workflows, and then literally the different, the CEO and also the chief risk officer would then sign off for the releases in Slack. So the legwork was taken out of it, but the process was still manual. And I think it's fair to say Starling Bank are pretty much, are pretty cloud native. Now, Richard, did you want to come in and ask that question yourself, or would you like Holly to maybe expand on what I just said?
No, I think that's fine. I think I was just reflecting on what earlier Ryan said, actually. So it was just, it's just kind of, it's great to talk about trying to automate a lot of this stuff. And Holly was quite correct that it's not about the technology and having a pipeline necessarily, but actually, having the entire sort of thinking to be cloud native. But there are these sort of external things, or what I kind of call the stones in the stream, so to speak, the things that you can't move, that you really essentially have to flow around, and those are the difficult things. So there's the kind of the showstoppers, or the create gates in the whole process. So that's really what I was kind of trying to get to.
Very good, thank you, Richard. That's really appreciated. That. Any more questions for Holly? We're kind of getting towards the end of the webinar now, but I must say most people are still here. That's always a good sign. Does anybody else want to unmute themselves and pop in and ask a question?
Yeah, hi, John is here. Do you have any tricks when we're talking about culture to get teams more take responsibility? We have some teams who actually don't want to have access to the production database and take ownership and actually just hands off like in the old days. So how to move people to take more ownership of their infrastructure, you can say?
Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? Because technology is easy and people are hard, and so you can't force a culture change. And probably in that case, I'd first want to understand why they have that reluctance, and there could be a few reasons. One One could be, again, that psychological safety sort of aspect of, I don't want more responsibility because then there's more things that I can get blamed for. And if I just stay in my swim lane, then I know I'm safe. Or the sort of the expertise side of that as well, of I don't want to do something that's hard because I might get it wrong. And if I just stay at the thing I'm good at, then I'm okay. Sometimes it can be, I'm hesitating over the word, but basically laziness, right? Like people, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that people don't have the passion to go further, and they're not really invested in the outcomes. And so the idea is, well, I do my job and I don't really care what happens beyond that. And that sort of needs a different fix. That's about how do we really get people excited about the outcomes that we're achieving. And part of that, I think, is sharing the success with them as well. And if we do something awesome, then as a team, let's celebrate. Another part of it is sort of like about, and again, this is so hard to change, but you can have two kinds of organizational structures, and they tend to be self-perpetuating either way. So if management think that people are little cogs in machines, then you won't have much team autonomy, and they will find that people need to be told what to do. And so that makes them convinced that they're right, that people are little cogs on machines, because look, if they don't give clear instructions, everything goes wrong. And whereas if you have a kind of a structure, a team culture where it's more autonomous and let's all do the right thing and let's figure out what the right thing is and let's have access to everything, then that will attract a certain kind of people. So in each case, it sort of ends up being self-reinforcing. And if you've got, if the team has sort of drifted quite far towards we're just little cogs and machines, it can be a big shift to go back the other way, because maybe, the temperament of the people is that they just don't want to work in that way, which is really hard to change.
Holly, what do you think about cloud native culture and hiring? And I think that what I'm really asking is, it does require, so for example, if you are willing to take responsibility for your work, if you've got a broad range of skills, if you're energetic, you're obviously very talented. What happens if organizations want to move cloud native and they just, have a fatigued workforce who, may be on the way to retirement? What do you do? Does cloud native require sort of high performing people, or is it possible to build a cloud native team from, let's just say, quite, normal people, I suppose, like you and I are?
I think, yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, again, I mean, certainly, like when we hire, we look for exactly the characteristics that you just described. That we don't look at the skills on the CV, because those are so 5 years ago. The skills that they're going to need next year are different. So we want to look for evidence of acquiring new skills. We want to look for curiosity. We want to look for problem solving. But that's easy if you're hiring a new workforce. If you've got an existing workforce, you can sort of try and emphasize to people, well, we want you to be learning, but the reason we're doing this isn't to try and get rid of you. The reason we're doing this is because we want to make your work better. And it is really natural to be anxious about it as well. We did a project, and it wasn't really sort of anything cloud native, but we were automating the process. So we were going to bring in AI, and it was this really manual process. And only afterwards did we realize that a whole bunch of the people in the company that we were working with had this major wobble, and they were so upset that a computer was going to take their jobs, and that, so we had to sort of then go back around and say, no, look, we're not trying to take your jobs. We just want you to be doing something more interesting. And then there's a sort of follow-up question of, do you want to be doing something more interesting? And if not, then, maybe we need to find a different role for you in a more boring part of the company.
Yeah. I still think that's cloud native's sort of unspoken secret or dirty secret, that often a company requires a whole different set of skills. And for many people, they have a reason to be anxious. There is a reason to be anxious when a wide sweeping change comes. because you might be left behind. And I would say cloud native benefits all organizations, but it doesn't benefit individuals equally. And it's a difficult one to talk about because you don't want to depress people or scare people to death. But it is certainly an element. And I know some of the executives we deal with are absolutely looking to, how would they say it, restructure their workforces, which is code for making people redundant.
Can I ask a quick question relating to this, actually? What is your experience against training up high functioning members of team to take on those roles and then train the others versus hiring pre-skilled people without the historic baggage to come in and then train down, based on the hiring comment that you made earlier? I'm just wondering how...
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you kind of get past one of the things that we've kind of raised is it'd be great to bring in new people to train everybody, but then you get a slight level of resentment from the people underneath who are having to sit and carry on doing the BAU stuff while all these new people come in and do all the shiny. But you get the extra manpower to help you achieve things. So I'm just wondering where you'd sort of stand on the...
Is that one directed to me or to Holly, Ryan?
Holly, but both as well, if you've got something you want to jump in.
Go for it, Holly.
Yeah, I mean, the model that we've usually used, and obviously, we have a really strong bias on this one because we're consultants. So the model that I'm most familiar with is bringing in consultants. And so then it's sort of, I think that fixes the resentment issue slightly because we're transient. And what we do is we try and do that co-creation and train people up and say, right, we're going to pair, we're going to mob, we're going to try and teach, we're not going to go hoard our skills. We want to be sort of really expansive and sharey with our skills, but then we're going to go away and this is going to be yours. We're just trying to give you a kickstart.
Yeah, something similar from us. I mean, to me, if people are disengaged out here, that's a leadership problem. So I wouldn't even be discussing what could a consultant do, who and how should we hire. I'd want to speak to the executives and the leadership and say, hey, what is going on here? What is your plan to take people on this journey? What is the strategy by which you win? You want to win hearts and minds, and it's always hearts followed by minds. You don't win minds and hearts. It's the other way around. But that being said, there are a few tips and tricks you can follow. Indeed, about training the trainer, we did this cool thing where we trained a few people at a company and then gave all the training materials so that the whole workforce was upskilled by their own people. That worked really well for us. But ultimately, tough decisions have to be made. And if you've got a management team that's unwilling to take tough decisions, if you've got 5 people in a group of 100 who are super resentful, super unhappy, and the company's carrying them, those 5 people will drag everything down. And I know as the chief executive of Container Solutions, I need to make good decisions in this regard. And you need to confront these difficult problems head on. So often, in my opinion, Ryan, a lot of companies try to go around. Richard mentioned earlier about going around the stones that you can't get rid of. There is still a place for good leadership. And part of that is taking, unpalatable decisions. But ultimately, if you want to succeed as a business, at least a few of those decisions might need to be taken.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anytime. Right, we're coming to the end now. I can see that everybody's still here. Almost everybody's still here. There's been a few people saying, sorry, I've got another meeting. So that's not our fault, Holly. That's because they're overscheduled. We're going to take one more question, and then I think we're going to start to wrap this up. Any more for any more? Well, I think that's perfect then. Okay, so then let's just summarize, if I may. So the links to the different articles and the maturity matrix and all of that are in the Zoom chat. The video will be made available after the webinar, and it'll be distributed to everybody via email. Also, the slides will be shared, my slides, Holly's slides, etc., etc. You can find Holly on Twitter, where you can ask questions, and I'm sure she's very happy to answer. And you can also ask me questions. I mean, I'm just a facilitator, but I'm also happy to point people in the right direction. With that in mind, finally, one other thing. Remember what we said about the holiday season, stress, anxiety, be compassionate. I must say that I'm not one for the Christmas season, but for the first time in 44 years, I'm bought into goodwill, kindness, forgiveness, because 2020 has just been fucking weird. So please bear that in mind. Now, if you'd like to give a small round of applause, we're going to go in reverse order. To my team from Container Solutions, Carla and Teresa, who make all of this happen. Keep that going. To you, the audience, to Richard, to Ryan, to Rob, to John, and all those brave people who ask questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to me. For
it wouldn't be a webinar without you. It'd be a monologue.
Thank you to me for my awesome facilitating. Thank you, Jamie. You're welcome. Most important, to Holly Cummins, our wonderful guest today, who has brought a little bit of IBM magic to proceedings. Holly, thank you so much. Bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And from Container Solutions, and I think from Holly, Merry Christmas, all the best, and may 2021 be a little bit less weird than 2020. See you later.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.